Thank you for coming back after lunch. And I've been asked to remind everyone to speak into the microphone because some of the Twitter, and apparently we're getting a lot of Twitter, which is good, but some of the Twitter says they can't hear very well. So that's not the kind of Twitter we want. So we are going to talk now about what the various parts of the ecosystem might do in order to improve how we communicate more responsibly and effectively about basic biomedical research. Just to recap a few things that we heard earlier in this regard, and we heard from Ivan about the idea of thinking in terms of the long game rather than in terms of the short game and short-term goals, and that's certainly something that resonated very strongly with me and I think with NIGMS. We heard about focusing on the people doing the science rather than just focusing on results or single papers from Erica this morning, and I think that's also a great idea. And we heard from Fintan about the idea of actually getting all of the incentives, perverse or otherwise, out on the table and discussing them openly when you're trying to decide on things like communication plans, which also sounded like a really good approach to me. We're going to hear now some other ideas, and I think we're going to hear both about current approaches that may be working, and then also hopefully about some ideas for future approaches that aren't yet operationalized. So I'd like to start with Matt, and maybe he could give us some ideas, and hopefully in the context also of the Health News Review model.
Okay, so I think the question in a sense is, are there current examples of best practices in terms of how stakeholders in this biomedical science communication ecosystem can work together to effectively communicate, right? So there are a couple different pieces here. One is from the perspective of the researchers, and again, I appreciate that this is asking a lot, but in order to collaborate effectively, they need to be willing to give time and patience, if necessary, to the institutional communicators that they might be working with, and to the reporters that they might ultimately be working with. And in order to make that time as pleasant as possible, I would encourage them to avoid, quote unquote, dumbing it down, because even thinking about it that way when you're going in, you're automatically assuming that you're going to be talking down to your audience, and your audience is not less intelligent than you are. It simply has a different technical background, right? So you just want to find shared language between you and the other person, right? So for example, by and large, astrophysicists tend to be very bright, right? And the same is often true of, say, geneticists, right? And yet, very few astrophysicists would be able to parse their way through a genetics paper and vice versa, right? So they don't have to dumb it down to talk to each other, right? They just need to find common language or shared language that they can use. And so if you have that in mind when you go in, I think that will make everybody happier. And for everybody involved, whether that's PIOs or public information officers like myself, or reporters or others, I think that the paradigm that Health News Review sort of espouses is really a very good one for talking about and thinking about biomedical research. There are 10 sort of variables that we focus on when we're evaluating a health story. And it's very, very difficult, being somebody who's not only reviewing people's stories, but also somebody who's writing these stories sometimes and has written them in the past, both as a reporter and as a PIO. I know that it is extremely difficult to check all of those boxes and do everything absolutely the right textbook way every time while maintaining narrative momentum and meeting my word count and so on, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to hit, a perfect 10 every single time, But if you're trying to hit a perfect 10 every single time, it will serve you well. And the sorts of things that that H&R looks at, Health News Review looks at, are things like, do you address cost? Do you quantify benefits and clearly define what those benefits are? Do you address harms? Do you articulate what the novelty of the findings are relative to the subdiscipline as a whole or previous work that had been done in that model or what have you? Do you articulate clearly who funded the work? And do you address how far removed it is from any sort of clinical availability? And I know at least one other person in this room is thinking, we're talking about basic research, Matt. We can't talk about the benefits or the costs or what the potential harms are yet because it's basic research, Matt. Well, here's the thing. If we're going to be talking about basic research in the context of what it may mean for some sort of clinical treatment, even if we're talking about it 5 or 10 years down the road or more, then it's also not too early to talk about cost and benefits and things of that nature in very broad language. So, for example, if you've, I don't know, I'm going to use a bunch of ridiculous words and we'll see what happens. Let's say that you've come up with super particle X, which is really great at getting rid of purple sneaker disease or something, right? You've done maybe a little animal model work. You haven't even really started clinical trials yet. So it is really, really not clear what Particle X would cost consumers when it reaches the marketplace, if it were ever to reach the marketplace. However, you do know that at this point, and this may be industrial engineers may change this, but at this point, it involves like 37 steps to make this thing. So it's probably not going to be cheap. So maybe somewhere in there, if you have the space, you might say, at present, it takes 37 steps to make Particle X. One of the things that we're planning to work on moving forward is see if we can find a way to streamline this process to make it less expensive and time-consuming. So you have addressed cost in a meaningful way that also shares additional relevant information without saying it's going to be $19.95 plus shipping and handling, right? So, and with that,
let me just ask you one other question. So based on your knowledge from Health News Review, what would you say are the fraction of news releases that were worth putting out?
Oh, man. That's a good question. With the proviso that I am incredibly cynical and jaded, I would say maybe 35-40% are worthwhile. And I think what's important to bear in mind here is, do I think 35 or 40% are, or flip it around, do I think 60 or 65% of news releases are news releases that the Washington Post or Scientific American, or whatever would cover? No, certainly not. But that doesn't mean that they're without value, right? It might be something which is going to be of interest to discipline-specific publications, like, so switching fields completely because I write a lot about engineering, right? It might be something that nobody else is going to write about, but IEEE Spectrum would probably do a piece on it. And if you're an electrical engineer, wahoo, that's like the best thing ever. So those discipline-specific or industry-specific things that can help you identify potential collaborators moving forward, potential funding sources to move from, sort of early animal models into more advanced or into early clinical trials. I think that there can be real value in doing those things. If we're talking about the percentage which are going to be relevant to large mainstream media, less than 5% probably would be my guess. maybe substantially less than 5%.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to put you on the hot seat, but got to make things interesting.
I did agree to come here, so.
Sarah, from your point of view as a reporter, what do you think are some best practices for reporting on basic research?
Best practices that we do or that everyone can employ?
Either would be good.
Okay. A lot of things that Matt just said, putting in context how far this is from the clinic, because again, unfortunately, that is what is going to get the news. And I think you alluded to earlier the people aspect. I know at Nature we struggle sometimes. We publish so much basic molecular biology, but that's a kind of a difficult thing for us to write about sometimes. But if there's a really interesting person who's doing it, or if it's got some impact for a particularly interesting demographic, that might be something that we would be able to frame a story that way and then get that news out that way. I have to say I don't take a whole lot of things from press releases very often because I get a gazillion of them. I'm sure that Erica and Jocelyn and everyone else do too. And to break through the noise, I think it's helpful if I know the person who's pitching me it and they demonstrate some familiarity with me, with what I cover, and with what Nature covers, and just kind of try and frame it as, well, this is why this moves beyond, ooh, we have a paper in Nature this week, you should write about it. I think what else? Patience with us, I think, is a good thing. We are going to ask stupid questions. Another thing I don't think scientists always know about journalists is sometimes we do ask questions we already know the answer to that sound really stupid because we would rather have you give us a really good quote rather than trying to frame it ourselves. So trying to understand we're not complete morons.
By really good quote, do you mean stupid quote? Or?
Well, something that puts it in your words because you're the ones who have thought about it a lot and are like, this is the pithiest way we can explain this in 10 words that I would never have thought of because I'm not steeped in this all the time. And it would just be nicer to have the expert saying it. Trying to think what else. Kind of some understanding on many sides of the different incentives that people have. We get accused sometimes like, oh, you put this just because you wanted to have a headline people will click on. Well, yeah, of course we want to have a headline people will click on. And the scientists want to fact check things or make sure that we understand all of these many caveats or name all of their funding agencies and whatnot, which are things that we aren't necessarily going to do in the same ways that they do. So having those conversations, if you're starting an interview as a scientist, kind of like, why are you going to do this way? I have this question for you. This kind of open-mindedness about the different cultures we're coming from, I think, is helpful. Yes, thank you. Yes, if you are going to email me a pitch and say, oh, we can set you up an interview with our expert, make sure that expert's actually there and you're actually there. Because sometimes we do function on a very tight turnaround, especially if there's something in the broader news. Like, I know some of the PR pitches that I do use sometimes, or if there's like, I don't know, a mass shooting or something, and someone from Georgetown reaches out and is like, oh, I got somebody who studies the psychology of mass shootings. Do you want to talk to him? Yeah, I want to talk to him, but I want to talk to him right now if that's the case, because this is in the news today. I think, anything else? I think Matt covered a lot of it. So.
Let me ask you a question then. So, and maybe Jocelyn also wants to weigh in. So, Science and Nature are examples of both a scientific journal publishing peer-reviewed research and a very high-level news organization. How is that potential conflict managed?
That is managed very simply, actually, at least for Nature, and I believe for Science as well, which is that we absolutely cannot talk to one another. And I think not everyone knows that, not everyone should be expected to know that, but we can't go to the editors and be like, hey, I met this really inspiring, interesting person at a meeting, and they really need the publicity. Can you take their paper? And they can't come to us and be like, you shouldn't write about this thing because I know this and that about this paper. I think that's, it's anything other than that we call the firewall, the Chinese wall, is really makes it too complicated. So, we can have drinks with one another, but we can't talk about it.
Yeah, I'd say the first part's true. I would never, if a scientist I meet at a meeting, wants to send something to science, I'll say, go ahead, I have nothing to do with that. But as far as we can get a little bit of feedback from our editors. It's not like we never talk to them about a paper, the manuscript editor, but they don't tell us whether to cover it or not. We decide that on our own.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of true for us too. We do sometimes get ideas of sources and stuff from them is helpful, but if we're going to write a story about open access publishing, they're not going to tell us what to do. Our editor-in-chief lets us criticize Nature's model if that's what the story is about. We interview our own editor-in-chief sometimes about open access stuff.
We heard about retractions earlier. You can cover retractions of your own journal, I suppose. Must be interesting. Lee, let's hear what you think.
So I actually have two things I want to say. One is actually just to kind of chime into some of the things that Matt and Sarah were saying. From the scientist perspective, I think it's really important to have these interactive conversations that happen in a respectful environment, and that they're bidirectional. So in my interactions with our PIOs, it's always really helped when they send their drafts to me, and and we're not working on the same time scale, but they send their drafts to me, and I say, oh yeah, maybe we should, change this a little bit, or, that's not quite what I was thinking when I said that. So I think that iterative nature is actually really helpful. The second thing I actually want to come back to a point that I made earlier, which is this distributed model of science communication. I think in the past, it hasn't been valued for scientists to go out and talk to people. And I, in my capacity at ASCB, have been really pushing to have that no longer be the model, to have to really support and encourage scientists to learn some basic science communication skills and engage with people. People don't know exactly what we do, and I think it's actually really good when more people more broadly know more about what we do, and they know the human side of it. You go to your kid's soccer game and you talk to the other parents on the sideline and say, yeah, my paper just got rejected, and this is my dilemma. And that humanizes the whole enterprise, and it gives it a personal side that I think helps people be more broadly supportive of funding scientists. I mean, really, honestly, we're funded by the public, right? Funneled through you guys, but I always feel like it's important to be able to justify what I do to the taxpayers who are actually paying for what I do. And I just have one little anecdote about this. When I was a postdoc, I was on a train in Philadelphia, and I was going home, and it had been a really long day, but I had a bouquet of flowers because I had gotten a grant, and I had been given this bouquet of flowers, and this guy on the train next to me said, what are those for? And I said, oh, I just got a grant. And he was like, well, what was it for? And I was just like, oh God, that's I can't even begin to explain. It's it's like 8:00 at night. I've been in the lab all day and I'm really tired. And he got really pissed at me. And he was like, you can't explain to me, what do you, and I was like, sorry, that wasn't what I meant. And so that was really educational to me. I mean, it really made me much more aware that I had a responsibility to in essence, justify myself, to explain what I do, to tell people what I do. And I've tried to never be that person again who says, oh, I'm too tired to explain to you.
Good story. Angela, you're batting cleanup here.
I will also tell a story about everyday interactions that I think illustrates a a broader point that I think is really important. The broader point, so that you know why I'm going to tell you this story, is about what we think about when we think about science literacy. Okay? And when we think about science literacy, we often think about knowing particular pieces of scientific information, certain facts that we know as scientists, which are a huge part of our own science education. But I think an even deeper, more meaningful definition of science literacy is knowing how science works. And so when we think about these everyday interactions that we're having, you know, it might not be as important to communicate the content of the thing that we are working on than it is to communicate the way in which we work on it. And so the story I will tell is about me in graduate school visiting some relatives who I did not see very often, and a little cousin of mine over the dinner table asking me what I did every day. And I was like, well, I'm in graduate school. And she's like, I thought you were done with college. And I was like, yeah, well, I'm like in more school. And she's like, well, what do you do? And I was like, well, I go to most of the days I go to the lab. I do some experiments and I read. And she was like, do you go every day? And I was like, no. Some days I read in like a cafe, or some days I like go to conferences or whatever. So it's this meandering explanation. And she's like, who's your boss? And I was like, well, my PI is my boss, but I really decide kind of what I want to do. And she's like, who pays you? And I was like, charity pays me because I was on a fellowship. And the whole table is very quiet. And then she goes, are you on welfare? and I was like, sort of. So I think, and we ended up talking all the way around it for quite a long time. But I think what that story demonstrates is that it's not a normal job the way that most people think of a job. And it's not, like, the reasons why we do it aren't always clear to people. Like that, so like at the same dinner table, another sympathetic cousin who was more my age was like, she's in last grade. This is like the last possible grade, right? And so, I think it's really important to realize that we don't have to start at this really technical place when we're describing what science is and what it's all about for us and why we do it and who we are as scientists. And so some of the better practices are going ahead and having these conversations, but also realize what conversation we're having and the value of the conversation that we're actually having, right? That when I explain my work, I don't necessarily have to talk about the intricacies of transcription. I can talk about this other stuff that might be an entry point that's equally valuable in the long term. The other piece I wanted to bring up is, if we're thinking about better practices, we're thinking not just about these sort of long-term values and goals that we have, but also like what concrete things can we do to make us more closely aligned with those values and long-term goals. And the point here that I want to make is that there are lots of things that we can do that are incredibly small and personal that don't require large institutional change, that instantiate those values and kind of allow us to like live it every day, right? That make, again, cascading effects in the long term. And so one of them is, in the context of talking with our trainees and colleagues, when they talk about their science communication activities, to be curious, interested, and supportive of it, right? Like we respond to our peer groups. And if you're a mentor of scientists, if one of your students says something about how they want to engage in more of these activities, celebrate it, help them out. Count it as an accomplishment of their training as they come back to you at the end of the year talking about their individualized development plan and where they want to go in their career, right? Like, you don't need anybody's permission for that. Just do it. The other thing, best practices wise, is educate yourself on what resources people can use to get better at this, right? So if somebody says, I want to go do some public engagement event, you can be like, great, I suggest you go look at like this webinar on best practices, or sounds like ASBMB has an amazing course online. Like, have a handful of tools that you can offer. Like, that's a really concrete thing that every single scientist can do right now. The other thing is to think about all the professional science communication that you do all the time that you control personally, like the way that you give a talk, right? Like, that is something that you do yourself every time you stand up. And you can do all kinds of things that instantiate the values that we talked about the entire time here. You can start your talk with why you choose to study this problem. What excited you about it? Why is it like the kind of problem that you like, right? Like, anchor yourself in your own viewpoint. Spend some time in your talk talking about what you don't know. Don't spend the whole time talking about all the things that are already published and that are amazing results and potentially not the things that still trouble you or like are still the great puzzles. Thank taxpayers at the end of your talk, right? Like, it's there. I guess I would just, when thinking about problems that are this big and that will require many years of concerted effort and policy changes and things like that, it can be sort of heartening to think about the sort of personal small moves that you can make all the time.
Thank you very much. Sounds like one of the themes we're hearing is a grassroots effort to communicate, maybe almost on a personal level from the scientific community. So that may be one important takeaway to bring from this. And I don't mean to harp on press releases, but let's just go back to this for a second, because that's very different from what you're espousing and some of what I heard others, Matt and others, espousing. And yet, as we've talked about, there is a big industry putting out press releases. Could you, two of you, talk about a little bit from your perspective, in academic institutions, what's the driver there? What's the culture? You talked about some problems before, Lee, but what about, where's it coming from your?
I think that one of the major drivers is that institutions run on reputation. And institutions, like a university, want to increase their reputation, both locally and internationally and nationally.
Unpack that for just a second, though. So when I was at Harvard, there was a saying, you can't eat prestige, right?
Right,
so
but Harvard
doesn't
doesn't
when you say it runs on reputation,
yes.
Where's that?
So I
where's
think
the next
that,
step with that?
I think that Harvard is probably a particular case because they come with a lot of prestige baggage, right? But at an institution like my institution, I say we, I use we as the big we. We're trying to increase our reputation. We're trying to become more widely known. We're trying to bring in more money. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, I think. We're about to engage in a new capital campaign, and when donors see our name in the news media, they think, oh, this is a successful institution, and we want to support that. But it's not just money. We want to increase our reputation to bring in better students or more applicants, to convince faculty who we make offers to that this is a place they want to come to. And I'm using my own particular institution as an example because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I suspect that it's true in most institutions that, and I think Kirk was saying some of this too at Georgia Tech, that the institution wants to increase its brand presence. I mean, we were just going through this whole branding process, and they want to have a bigger impact than they currently do, and the way they do that is by increasing the attention. I was reading something on the way down here about that we currently live in an attention economy, that it's the number of people that are paying attention to you that is more important than anything. And so if people don't know who you are, then you're not a player in the attention economy. So.
Angela.
So I'm at Harvard, but at the medical school, and I can't speak to the sort of institutional structure around press releases. I'm relatively junior. I've had my lab for 10 years, so I sort of haven't been in that tier of the institution. But what I can speak to is the perception from the sort of junior faculty side of what is press release worthy, and that the conversation about engaging with the communications community at the institutional level tends to start at the idea of a press release. And actually, I think that's a deep flaw. And so one of the ideas that we've heard repeatedly from the journalists here is that you guys get too many press releases anyway. They're not that useful to you. And that cultivating relationships with people inside of the community to discuss and vet ideas and understand like tips about what's interesting and what's coming is a much deeper and more valuable conversation or sort of route to understanding what's going to happen. And I would argue that having more robust links between those two communities would also serve a bunch of other goals well also, right? In the sense that having a conversation that isn't focused on building a press release could give a much deeper sense of the motivations that you guys are coming from. And I would feel as much more comfortable trying to help in that situation than trying to like come up with a frame that makes my work the most, exciting from some particular narrative frame. So I guess that's a long way of saying that I think the press release has come to dominate what we think is happening from institutional communications offices, and there's a lot of weirdness around judging yourself about what's press release worthy or not, and the fact knowing then that they're also sort of weird dead ends once they leave the university in a lot of ways is strange, and it seems that we should rethink whatever that conversation is such that it's serving people's engagement goals more specifically, both in the short term and the long term. And as a faculty member, I would be very happy to participate in those sorts of one-on-one discussions, especially if they weren't always necessarily geared towards the production of this particular kind of thing.
Can I come back and make
One
more point about this? Because I actually, being at a completely different kind of institution, I don't think that the whole press release economy is completely without merit. And I mean, I have seen benefits from these press releases of my work and other people's work, but it's not necessarily. And somebody said this earlier, it's not necessarily, getting the attention of the New York Times or Washington Post, but it's getting the attention of, the Albany Times Union or the Troy Record. And that has a lot of benefit. And I think that it's exciting for our neighbors to know what we're doing. And so I have another little tiny anecdote about this. One of my colleagues just published a story on autism, and I actually hadn't even known he was working on autism. It was a little weird, but I live on a farm, and I have a farrier who comes to cut my horse's hooves, and I was talking to my farrier, and usually we're talking about like mules or something, and he was like, hey, so I heard you guys are doing some work on autism. And I was like, we are? But he had heard this story on the local news, and he was really excited about it because in his other job, he's a school bus driver. And so he has experienced a lot of kids on the autism spectrum, and he thought this was really exciting. And I thought that was great that, this guy who drives a school bus and cuts my horse's hooves, trims my horse's hooves, was really excited about something that was happening at our university. And this was, I thought that was a really positive thing. And I'm sure that press release didn't get picked up by the New York Times, but it got picked up by some local newspaper.
So Matt, you talked about the importance of local stories before. Is the press release a good way to get to that, or are there other more effective ways?
I think that news releases can be extremely valuable tools. But the way that it works for me most often is either I will have reached out and said, hey, Jess, do you have anything interesting going on that we should talk about? Or somebody will contact me and say, there's this paper I'm super excited about that's about to come out. Can we talk about it? But when I go to meet with them, I don't have some preconceived notion of what the outcome of that meeting is going to be. So sometimes it's, I'm super excited for you. This has no legs, go with God. Sometimes, it's a news release. Sometimes we'll do a Q&A, and we'll run that in a straight-up Q&A format with maybe an introductory paragraph. Sometimes it's just a direct pitch where there's nothing that's put online by us anywhere, but I'll contact the 3 reporters that I know will care just directly. Like, hey, Rich, Stacy, and Ann, X is about to happen. Sometimes it might be more of a feature style that I would be doing for our research site, but with an eye towards the funding agency being able to use it in some capacity. It really depends, both on the material, what the researcher is comfortable with, and what else might be going on. So, for example, if they say, well, so this is the first paper, and we've got another paper that's been submitted but hasn't been accepted yet. I'm thinking, maybe within the next 6 months or so that we're really excited about. Well, then you don't want to blow the doors off on the first one, right? You want to keep your powder dry a little bit so that when the second one pops, people don't say, didn't you tell us something that was awfully similar to this a few months ago? So there are a lot of variables that come into play. But a news release, I think, still does have very real value under certain circumstances.
Do you worry at all, though, about some of the things Angela was saying, that somehow getting a press release is, A, the thing people think is communicating science,
B,
a badge of honor?
Well, I don't know so much. I think there are certainly some people that feel that, it's, I don't know, a laurel for their epaulet or whatever. Totally mixed metaphors there. But there are a lot of people who I think don't really think about it at all. They just are like, oh, this is what you do now. So, okay, get paper accepted, check, next box, get news release, okay, and then I'll give you a very good example that's not findings driven. Somebody would say, hey, we're having a symposium, and we're bringing in some people that we're really excited about, and it's going to be super amazeballs, and everyone's going to love it. Okay, I'm like, okay, so we need to do a news release for this. I'm like, okay, so do you want reporters to come? No. Well, then we don't want to do a news release. Do you want members of the public to show up? Well, no, we do not. Okay, this has been a super good talk. I wish you all the luck in the world with your symposium, but that's not what I do, right? If you don't want people to show up or ask questions about it, why on earth would you be talking to the press guy? And it's because there's this sense that this is just part of the process and this is what you do, right?
Sarah, we heard some about tips before. Now we've heard about local press versus grassroots. What would be most useful in terms of your interaction with the scientific community helping to communicate science?
Well, Matt just brought up a point that I regretted not having said before, which is symposiums and meetings. I don't think that PIOs always think about those. We go to them. We go to a lot of them. I go to a lot of them. I get way more ideas from talking to scientists at meetings than I ever do from the 80, 100 press releases I get every single day from every organization that I have no time to look through. And people tell us, oh, we've got a scientist who's got a Nature paper coming up. we already know about it. I mean, not Nature, but like any big publication, we already know about it. So but if you let me know, oh, here at Hopkins, where you're nearby, we've got a symposium. We're bringing in all of these people. It's on kind of an obscure topic. We don't think there's probably going to be a whole lot of press there, but since you've written about this topic before, if you want to come, you'd be welcome. I'm totally going to go to that. Well, if it's interesting. Or if somebody's got like a presentation at Society for Neuroscience meeting or something, you're like, hey, they're going to be presenting some new results there. They haven't published yet. Just wanted to let you know in case you're interested. That I will totally respond to. Sorry, what was your question?
You just answered it. That was
it?
But it was how the scientific community can best engage with the media.
It's a really big question. I don't know if I have a whole lot else to add to what else has been said already.
So go ahead, Angela.
I would actually return to this idea that we talked about earlier, which is that when we think about talking to the public, we might actually be talking to ourselves at sort of different levels of resolution, right? And so the idea that the press is at scientific conferences should motivate all of us to make our talks more accessible and interesting and engaging and respectful of people's level of background knowledge and attention over what tend to be incredibly long days, right? So I feel like this could be another like very simple way in which we could make things better, right? Which is that we tend to give long parades of talks that are very technical without realizing, again, our sort of goal for the meeting, which is to like put a flag in the sand and be like, I'm somebody who knows something about this problem and I'm pretty fun to talk to and you should come find me later. And if you want to read the paper, it's published, right? The goal is not to give your paper in 10 minutes. And so I think that again, if we were to talk about teaching science communication more generally, keeping in mind this whole ecosystem of where people get their information from, by trying to talk more intelligently and respectfully to Sarah at a meeting, I would do a better job of talking to all the scientists at that meeting too. And so again, it's a sort of win-win in my mind.
Yeah, very good points. And I think that if you read news articles and kind of spend some time thinking about the way they're structured for scientists, that's kind of the way we think as well, where you've got like your lead, which is the big picture, the snappy thing, what's most interesting about this. I think someone mentioned earlier, a lot of scientific talks are like, here's all of this background, blah, 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 blah. If you get right to the point, I mean, I'm only reading the subject line in my email. I'm not if I'm on the phone and I've only got a few minutes with someone, I'm going to cut you off if you can't get to the point of your research after a while. So I think that spending some time thinking about how you're going to put that forward, just structurally, is important, and also giving a bigger picture. It depends on which media you're talking to, of course, but if you can give it, and medical stuff is the obvious one. If you're like, well, this is a huge cure for diabetes or something, that's an obvious thing. But there's other things to think about too, like this is a way where we've formed this interdisciplinary partnership. I remember being really inspired when I was a student by this story someone did about someone who had studied breast cancer and found some sort of like radiological method to look at the formation of tumors, and then gotten a job with the military using that same thing to detect underground explosives. So like that sort of thing, it's like, I don't really care about this new radiological method for breast cancer because there's a lot of those, but that's really neat that you were able to bridge that. So if there's some like neat sort of angle like that, that's something that we also would like to hear about.
Yeah, I think the question is, what can the research community do to sort of support meaningful science communication? I think one of the things that is really, really critical, and this is the thing that when I was thinking about this before today, as I was planning to come up, this is the thing I really want to get across, and I cannot overemphasize it. So first of all, while I do not feel that any scientist should be obligated to engage in outreach, unless it is actually part of their job description. I do think that institutions need to do two things with regard to incentives, right? Or at least one of two things. The first thing is, at the very least, they need to remove disincentives from people who choose to engage. So, for example, I'll not use this person's name. I will say this person is not at NC State, right? But I know a guy who was denied tenure because his department did not think that he took his research seriously enough because there was a National Geographic special about his work. The dean then stepped in and overruled the department, and he did get tenure. But that sort of, and it can be a culture within a department, it can be a culture within a college or at the university level. It really varies. But that attitude that being willing to talk about your work means that you do not take your work seriously is BS. And it is really, really frustrating, and it does a disservice to the relevant field and to the relevant researchers. And it really gets my goat. So this is the most PG language I've ever used. Those of you who have seen me speak at other conferences know this to be true. The second thing is that not only do I think we should remove those disincentives, but we should create some sort of real meaningful incentive, right? Now, this should not be a mandate where everyone has to do it, but if somebody does choose to do it and do it in a meaningful way, right, then it should count toward tenure, or maybe it doesn't count toward tenure, but you have to teach, fewer course hours or whatever. But particularly for early career researchers, right, who are super duper enthused, they're not that jaded yet, right? Those are very often the exact people that you want out there, and it also serves them well because the more they raise their profile, the easier it is for them to attract great graduate students, to identify potential collaborators moving forward. There's real value there. And for them to have to put in that time and not be recognized for that work, and it is work, is, I think, short-sighted. I really think institutions need to look at this and evaluate it and figure out what they can do in a meaningful way to acknowledge the value of that sort of work.
How do you measure that, though? Certainly, if you're getting to the kind of grassroots communication that we were hearing about here, it's much harder to measure than if your paper had, again, a press release.
Well, sure, but it's certainly not impossible. And in many ways, it's actually easier to measure that than it is to measure a press release, right? So, for example, North Carolina State University runs the extension program for the entire state. So we do an awful lot of this kind of thing. Like we have people that 50 or 60 or 80% of their appointment is extension, meaning that they're going out to 4-H clubs and Kiwanis club meetings, or a farmer will call because several cattle have gotten sick on this piece of land and they can't figure out why, and so we send out our little cattle detectives or whatever, CSI cow, yeah, that's all I got. It's late, folks. It's late in the day. So you can do things like you could evaluate like how many of these sorts of events. You could evaluate how many like people were in attendance. You could work with somebody in one of your social science departments, like Dr. Dudo, to do like to create new knowledge out of it, where you're doing before and after questionnaires of people who are in attendance to see, are you actually making a difference? Are you changing the way people think or feel about whatever the subject is? I mean, there certainly are ways that this can be done, but again, that's why I say that this is work, right? This is work. This is not happy fun time all the time. So it should be valued and acknowledged in that way, in my opinion.
So let's roll with that theme. Sarah, what do you think are some of the barriers to the kind of change we're hearing about?
I think it's interesting that because I hear that story you were just saying about the National Geographic guy, and I hear that sometimes. I guess I feel like I never run into that, though. I feel like compared with other journalists, if I talk to other journalists and other beats, we have it so easy because so many scientists want to talk about their work. And they can't believe that someone wants to listen to me talk about this thing that no one cares about. And I mean, maybe we can do a better job presenting ourselves as like, look, we're legitimately interested in this. Can you tell us about it? And yeah, I just kind of wanted to.
Well, that's because you only talk to the ones that are willing to talk to you.
But I feel like most of the ones, maybe I only talk to the interesting ones. No, because I feel like I cold email people all the time. Just like I saw you had a grant on NIH Reporter, I want to hear more about it. And I feel like I almost always get emails back. If I email someone, I'm like, hey, I hear there's a huge scandal at your institution. Do you want to tell me about it? No one ever emails me back about that. But I mean, yeah, it's maybe you can like tell them that reporters are nice people, or if there's some way that we can like have a better dialogue beforehand about what's expected?
It really varies depending on the culture that they're in. So if they're in a culture where the people who have tenure really sort of, frankly, are kind of snide about working with reporters, then early career researchers are going to want to cover their behinds, right? Man, I am doing so well today on curse words, folks. But in the absence of that, you don't see it as much. And what I've found is that the number of people who have that unserious scientist, like people that talk to media are unserious, they're becoming fewer and fewer. And frankly, they're retiring off.
Lee.
So I had a thought, and now it's slipped my mind because I was agreeing with Matt.
Barriers to change.
Oh, I did have a thought. So one thing that it's not exactly an answer to the barriers to change question, but it's a slight segue. I was wondering what you, as an NIH representative, feel about the additional other kinds of incentives. So I'm thinking about, obviously, incentives are things like getting promotion and tenure, but also getting grants. And obviously, NSF has a model which explicitly asks people to address issues like outreach in their broader impacts. And most NIH grants don't. And so I was wondering if you had thoughts on that. So I'm turning the question back on you.
That's fair enough. Turnabout is fair play.
Just one other thing is that I know that American Cancer Society is now asking people to comment on their science outreach activities in their grant proposals also.
So for our Maximizing Investigators Research Award, MIRA, we do have a component of the review, which is looking at people's service to the scientific community. It's not as expansive as the NSF's component, but we do feel that those sorts of contributions to science should be considered. The other place we're working on this is in our graduate education, our training grants, and we're soon going to release a completely revised funding opportunity announcement for that. And that will contain a focus on skills development across the entire spectrum, including what we're calling professional skills and the kinds of communications that we're hearing about here, not just in terms of communicating to scientists, but in terms of the grassroots things you're talking about, will be one of the things we're hoping to see. So I'm liking what I'm hearing here because it's consistent with our thinking.
I really like hearing that because I think that we can talk about changing the culture of academic departments as much as we want, but that's like steering battleships. But I think that Angela's point about the little things that we can do to change are are good ways to incrementally change the direction of that battleship. But NIH has a big
We're the
engine.
ocean at some point.
Well, you have a big engine to change that battleship, because basically we want to do what pleases you.
Angela, what do you think of barriers?
So I have thoughts on sort of the things that we've said at the institutional level. I think that it would be great if there were ways to incentivize people through grant mechanisms such that people aspire to do more. Just to provide a complementary view, I'll talk about a couple more of these sort of like things you can do tomorrow kinds of things. The first one is to talk about the rewards of doing public engagement, because one of the real barriers is that people tend to think of their time as a zero-sum game, right? That if I spend time doing this other thing, it takes time away from my research, and my research will suffer. And I think that that is a false dichotomy. In my experience, doing public outreach is not a zero-sum game. It's also, doing other activities outside of science actually enriches your science. It makes you more resilient to failure. It gives you a better experience, like perspective on your own work and why you're doing it and why it matters to other people, such that it can be incredibly motivating to keep going when you're sort of constantly hitting your head against a brick wall. And so I think emphasizing the rewards that exist both at the in sort of long-term skills development, good for your career, long-term emotional health, such that you are, a resilient person who can find joy in doing a job that's very hard, and the long-term societal value of doing something that's meaningful and important to sustain science, which is, I presume, something that you love, right? And so it's not a zero-sum game. So that would be the first thing about incentives that I think is sort of removing a disincentive on a personal level for people. The second piece that I wanted to speak to was the idea of how you measure it. And I think this is where scientists we like to think of ourselves as incredibly data-driven, right? But if you think about what the major mechanism is for tenure decisions, it's letters. And it's letters from other experts in the field who are tasked with evaluating your impact on their own thinking and the field at large. And there's no reason why you couldn't solicit letters from public stakeholders to speak to exactly those kinds of issues. And so metrics are important, and structured studies and feedback is really important for evaluating and improving, and I think that that's one part of the equation. But we should not underestimate the fact that we make decisions based on very human assessments of other people all the time. And that's actually a big part of how we do business already. And so by including different voices in that packet of people who are allowed to speak about your impact, that could be useful too. I think that that's probably all that I would. I'm good with that.
Good.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I thought that was a great discussion, and now I think we're going to segue into, I believe, the last part where it falls to, I think, me and HUD to try to get all of you to wrap this up and think about what the next steps are. Oh, Yvette says we're doing everything right now. HUD moves? Thank you to the panelists.